Welcome back yet again for another live studio interview. My name is Christina Progiato and I have the honor to interview Jyoti Guptara today. He's an internationally recognized speaker and he's also a business storytelling consultant. Welcome, Jyoti. Welcome to our studio.
Thanks, Christine. It's great to be back.
Of course, it's lovely to have Jyoti here because he's very involved with the Drucker Forum for years. He's actually a judge on the Drucker Challenge as well. And today we're going to be talking about his book, Business Storytelling from Hype to Hack, which Walmart CEO named one of his top personal reads in 2022. That sounds pretty good to me. I also know the book already and got some sneak peeks into it and some interesting new insights. So we're happy to be discussing your book today. But first and foremost, I need to ask this question, Jyoti, because your background is actually a bit of a different one. You were actually a novelist and you wrote fiction books, one of which I believe was also a national bestseller in India. So tell us the story.
That was a long time ago.
That was a long time ago, for sure. But tell us your story. How did you go from fiction writing to advising organizations in stories?
Right, who led this guy into the Drucker Forum? I actually still write fiction. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Nashville to promote my new thriller called Roulette, which we won't talk about today. So, as you said, I had a great start to my writing career as a teenager, and I was a full-time writer for about 10 years, and I loved it and still really enjoy it. And one of the perks of being a more or less successful writer was being invited on book tours and as a speaker and so on. But opportunities also opened up to be a writer in residence at, for a city, for example, in Switzerland, Stein am Rhein, beautiful, picturesque place, but also as a United Nations partner organization. And that's where the penny dropped for me, because we had brilliant people coming through the GCSP, CEOs on sabbatical, ambassadors, spies, and these people obviously were brilliant. They had great expertise and experience, obviously, but when they were on stage, you often couldn't really tell why are they so passionate about this topic, or why should we care about what they apparently care about, but that we're not seeing. And then you'd have lunch with these same people, and you would be fascinated by the stories that they would share.
So there was obviously a gap that you saw.
Exactly. So that's how I got into executive education at the GCSP, and I was teaching diplomats a module called Story as Influence. And of course, influence is something that everybody needs in business as well. So I got into not strategy development, I'll leave that to others, such as our fabulous speakers here. But a lot of what consulting companies do is they help you figure out what to do, or they tell you what to do, but they don't necessarily help you implement, right? And there are a growing number of companies who do help you implement your strategy now. But I still think there's a missing link between the formulation and the implementation, and that's the translation of the strategy so that employees understand what are you even talking about and engage.
Okay.
And so that's what I help people do now.
So that's actually very interesting, because that would have been one of my questions, what leaders actually need stories for. And I think you just nicely put it together, that it's a lot about, how they come off on a stage, for example, versus over a lunch table, but also transmitting their strategy so it makes sense.
Right, and there's so many other reasons why leaders need to tell stories. Imagine if there were a pill you could give your audience that would make them pay attention to you. Because nowadays everyone's being bombarded with all sorts of messages. So imagine you could give a pill to an individual or a group and they would pay attention to you, they would feel more positive about your message, and they would be more likely to act on it, right? This pill is free. It's legal, it's even healthy. That's storytelling, of course, because it really does something to our brains. And for the last decade or so, we've been able to measure what it does to the brain.
So this is really interesting. So talk us through it. Why is storytelling such a great communications technique? Why is it such a good pill to take?
Well, in business, traditionally, we focused on statements and statistics. And they are very necessary, of course, but they do only reach two areas of the brain, which is Wernicke's and Broca's area for data and language processing. And that's not bad, right? But a story is much more holistic than that. It can light up to 7 regions of the brain. And we don't want to reach narrow slices of our people, right? We want to engage people holistically. Let me give an example, right? Because I'm giving you statements and statistics, and I think a great example is Walmart. You know, I gave a talk for them earlier this year, and they had ample examples for me to share because there was a gentleman called Don Soderquist. Now, he was the COO of Walmart, and he worked very closely with Sam Walton, the founder, and he would help people to understand how Sam Walton thought and taught, and the lessons that Don Soderquist learned from Sam Walton directly, he was able to share with Walmart, I think they're at 2.3 million employees now. And there's this great story that Don would tell about how, Sam Walton had this sort of compulsive, obsessive way of going into pretty much every competitor's store that he would pass. And so one day he drags along Don Soderquist, the CEO, and he says, Don, we're going to meet back at the car in 15 minutes. Let's go and scope out this competitor. So they go in, and Don's done after about 1 minute, right? Because this is a terrible shop. There are empty boxes lining the aisles, right? You could stumble over them. No one's there to answer questions. So after 2 minutes, he's back at the car. Eventually, Sam comes out and he says, Don, what did you think? He says, these guys are terrible. They're not really our competition. But what do you think, Sam? And Sam Walton says, Don, did you see the pantyhose rack? They have a brilliant pantyhose rack. We're nowhere close, right? And this happens several times where Sam Walton basically says, we have to learn from what they're doing here and there. Now, contrast this story with what we would typically do in business, which is, hey, folks, we shouldn't rest on our laurels. It's important that we're always improving. What conveys the message better?
Yeah. I think that was a very, very good example. Thank you for making it so practical and handy. I would like to touch upon the word hack that you use in your book. It's also in your title, From Hype to Hack. And by hack, we're trying to be effective and efficient, a very Druckerian philosophy, as we know. So can you elaborate more on that? What informed this approach about hacks?
I'm a big fan of hacks, Silicon Valley thinking, startup mentality. How can we do things more efficiently and effectively? And from the start, for me, it was clear that stories were a way of helping people to accomplish business objectives, basically faster and more humanly. So one of the pushbacks that I got when I said, storytelling as a way of hacking things and ultimately people as well, right, is sounds a bit dodgy, like neuro-linguistic programming or something like that. But as I say in the book, it's not about anything dodgy like that. It's about hacking what gets in the way of the human connection. So this book does two things. First, it presents stories as a way of hacking 7 common areas in business, from marketing and sales to the strategy. But secondly, it shows you how you can hack the art of stories, of learning to tell stories that work. Because, Malcolm Gladwell would say it takes 10,000 hours. And let's be honest, who has that kind of time? So
speaking about time, thank you for this keyword here. I think many of us agree, like storytelling is a great skill to learn, and we all like to master it. We all want to be understood. But how can we practically do this in real life? How can we find the time to actually learn this and apply it? Do you have any tips for us?
Sure. So there are several tools and techniques I give in the book. One practical recommendation would be start a collection of stories. Think about, when do I often need to influence somebody? First column would be target audience. Second column, the message. As in, I need to convince my employees to, be punctual or whatever it is. And third row would be telling stories about behavior change. And that sounds a little bit like a task, right? Like, when are you going to do that? But to answer your question about really a simple, low-stakes environment in which you can practice storytelling every single day, we met just before we came in here, and you asked me, how are you, right? So we're always asking each other, how are you? And we tend to answer, how we slept the previous night and the weather and stuff like that. Instead, we could tell each other what we're working on and what we're passionate about. And that way, we can practice our storytelling every single day, multiple times, with no pressure.
That sounds amazing. Thank you for this tip. I think we can all practice it at this conference and in our everyday lives for sure. A very brief final word on how can we actually connect resilience to this whole topic of storytelling. Do they have anything to do with each other?
Oh, so much. We could talk about that for a whole segment.
Just very brief, please.
I observe a narrative vacuum a lot of the time in organizations. So one of the first things you want to do is illustrate your values, for example, or other messages that you claim to stand for. And you may have wording that sounds nice on your website, but do people really believe you? It's a lot to do with trust. So let's say you have a certain value, but if you can't tell me a story about a time that you demonstrated that value,
Yes.
I might not believe you because everybody else is saying the same thing. So don't risk having a narrative vacuum because that leads to instability. It means that you're vulnerable to negative narratives.
That makes sense. So storytelling also creates trust, and that leads also to resilience. Thank you so much, Jyoti, for enlightening us a bit more on this topic of storytelling. Thank you for coming into the studio. And now we have another interview coming up here on Drucker Forum TV with Hubert Joly. Enjoy.